If this video showed up for you, it's because this story is going to move you and give you chills. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of story, and comment which city you're watching from. The automatic doors of St. Jude's emergency room slid open with a mechanical hiss, admitting a gust of cold, rain-soaked air. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour where the world feels suspended in a heavy, silent gray. Dr. Elena Russo rubbed her eyes, the smell of sterile antiseptic and stale coffee clinging to her scrubs. The waiting room was empty, save for the hum of the vending machine and the relentless drumming of the storm against the glass. She expected a drunk driver, perhaps a straggler from a bar fight. But when she looked up, there was no person standing in the doorway. Instead, a large shadow loomed at the threshold. A German shepherd, his coat drenched and matted with mud, stood completely still. His ears were pinned back, not in aggression, but in a posture of desperate submission. He was shivering, his ribs slightly visible beneath the wet fur, but his eyes, deep, intelligent ambers, were locked onto Elena's. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He simply took a step forward, his claws clicking rhythmically on the linoleum floor. But it wasn't his presence that made Elena's breath hitch in her throat. It was what he was carrying. Clamped gently in his powerful jaws was a bundle wrapped in a soaked gray flannel shirt. Elena froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Stray dogs didn't just walk into emergency rooms, and they certainly didn't carry packages with such delicate care. The dog took another step, his gaze shifting from Elena to the bundle in his mouth, then back to her, pleading. He whined, a low guttural sound that vibrated with an urgency that transcended species barriers. Elena slowly lowered her clipboard, her instinct screaming that this wasn't a random animal, this was a mission. But she had no idea that the contents of that bundle would shatter her composure completely. "Hey, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you have there?" The dog approached her slowly, respecting the space, but driven by a ticking clock only he could hear. He lowered his head and gently, with the precision of a surgeon, placed the bundle at her feet. He nudged it once with his wet nose, then looked up and let out a single sharp bark. Elena knelt, her hand shaking as she reached for the gray flannel. The fabric was cold, soaked through by the freezing rain. She pulled back the first layer, then the second. A tiny, pale hand fell out. "Code Blue, I need a team here now!" Elena screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet lobby. The bundle wasn't a toy. It was an infant, a baby, boy, no more than 6 months old. His skin blue and mottled, his breathing shallow and rattling. The dog stepped back, watching intently as nurses and orderlies rushed the scene. He didn't run. He sat on his haunches, alert, watching the chaos he had orchestrated. As they scooped the child up and ran toward the trauma bay, the dog didn't leave. He simply laid his head on his paws and let out a long, weary sigh. He had done his part, but he knew the night was far from over. Inside the trauma room, the air was thick with tension. "Core temp is dropping," a nurse shouted. "He's severely dehydrated and malnourished. Start a warm saline drip." Elena worked frantically, intubating the tiny throat. The baby was fragile, like a porcelain doll left out in the storm. As the monitors began to beep with a steadier rhythm, signaling stabilization, Elena looked at the child's wrist. No bracelet. No name. Just a baby brought in from the cold by a guardian angel with 4 legs. "Who brought him in?" Officer Miller asked, stepping into the room 10 minutes later, his radio crackling. He had been on patrol nearby when the call came in about an abandoned infant. "A dog," Elena said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "A German shepherd. He's still in the lobby." Miller frowned, skepticism written across his face. He walked out to the waiting room. The dog was still there, sitting like a statue near the entrance. Miller, a veteran of the force, paused. He knew dogs, and he knew this kind of dog. The posture, the discipline, the focused gaze, this wasn't a stray. "Max?" Miller whispered, almost to himself. He recognized the scar on the dog's left ear. This was Max, a retired K-9 unit, a legend in the department who had been retired out to a handler 2 years ago. But his handler had passed away last month. Max was supposed to be in a shelter or fostered. Why was he here? And where did he find a baby? Miller approached slowly, extending a hand. Max sniffed it, his tail giving a single weak wag. He was exhausted, but as soon as Miller clipped his spare leash onto his collar, the dog's demeanor changed instantly. The fatigue vanished, replaced by a sharp, electric tension. Max turned toward the automatic doors and pulled hard. He wasn't looking for a treat. He wasn't looking for a warm bed. He barked at the darkness outside, looking back at Miller with eyes that held a terrifying story. "He wants us to show us something," Miller said into his radio, a cold shiver running down his spine. "Dispatch, I'm following the canine. He led the baby here, but I think he's telling us there's someone else out there." Max didn't wait. As soon as the doors opened, he bolted into the rain, dragging Miller into the pitch-black night. The dog's nose was to the ground, tracking a scent that was rapidly being washed away by the storm. They ran past the manicured hospital lawns, past the streetlights, heading toward the edge of town where the pavement turned to cracked concrete and the street lamps flickered and died. Max was on a mission, and he wouldn't stop until he finished what he started. But neither Miller nor the medical team back at the hospital could have guessed where Max was taking them. He wasn't leading them to a dump or an alleyway. He was leading them toward the old, condemned district, specifically to a house that had been abandoned for a decade, a house that everyone in town avoided because of the stories. As the silhouette of the rotting Victorian home came into view, jagged lightning illuminated the broken windows. Max stopped at the front gate and let out a howl that sounded less like a dog and more like a soul in mourning. Miller unhosted his flashlight, his heart pounding in his ears. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. "Police!" Miller announced, his voice swallowed by the storm. Max pulled again, dragging him up the rotting steps. Whatever was inside that house, Max was desperate to get to it, and Miller had a sinking feeling that they were about to find the reason why a baby had been entrusted to a dog in the middle of the night. Miller stepped across the threshold, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick, swirling dust motes. The air inside smelled of damp rot and something else, something faintly sweet like baby powder, which felt jarringly out of place in this tomb of a house. Max didn't hesitate. He bypassed the debris-strewn living room, his claws clicking urgently on the warped floorboards, leading Miller down a narrow hallway toward the back of the house. The shadows stretched long and twisted against the peeling wallpaper, creating the illusion of movement in the corners of Miller's vision. Every instinct in his body screamed that they weren't alone, or at least that the ghosts of recent tragedy were still lingering here. Max stopped abruptly in front of a door that was hanging off its top hinge. He whined again, that same high-pitched sound of distress he had made at the hospital. Miller pushed the door open with his boot, his hand hovering over his holster, ready for anything. But nothing could have prepared him for the heartbreaking scene illuminated by his flashlight. It was a nursery, or at least the most desperate attempt at one Miller had ever seen. In the center of the room, away from the leaking ceiling, was a cardboard box lined with towels and a thick wool blanket. A small, ragged teddy bear sat propped against the side. Empty cans of cheap baby formula were stacked neatly in a corner, alongside a single empty water bottle. It was a shrine of survival. Miller holstered his weapon, a lump forming in his throat. Someone had been living here, hiding in the squalor, trying to keep a fragile life warm in the belly of a freezing winter. But it was what lay on top of the makeshift crib that made Miller's blood run cold. A piece of torn notebook paper weighed down by a stone. Miller picked it up, his gloved hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, the ink smeared in places as if by tears or rain. He shined his light on the page and began to read. Max, sitting silently by his side, watching him read the words he already knew by heart. "To whoever finds this, his name is Noah. I have nothing left. No home, no money, no milk. The cold is getting into his bones and I can feel him fading. I'm failing him. I prayed for a miracle and God sent me a dog. This dog, he has a soul. He watched over us when the rats came. He kept Noah warm when I couldn't stop shivering. I trust him more than I trust myself right now. Please tell Noah I didn't leave him because I didn't love him to watch him die in my arms. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Rachel." Miller lowered the paper, a heavy silence settling over the room. It wasn't a crime scene.
It was a testament to a mother's breaking point. She didn't abandon him. She saved him. But the note had a finality to it that terrified him. I trust him more than I trust myself right now. Where was Rachel now? Max, Miller said sharply, his voice commanding. Find her, find Rachel. The dog's ears perked up at the name. He barked, a loud, resonant sound that shook the ceiling from the dusk, and spun around, bolting back down the hallway. Miller sprinted after him, bursting back out into the storm. The rain had turned into a deluge, washing away the world in sheets of gray. Max didn't head back toward town. He turned sharply left, scrambling over a broken fence and tearing through high weeds toward the municipal park that bordered the condemned district. The park was a desolate place at night, a graveyard of rusted swing sets and overgrown paths. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, sounding like human cries. Miller struggled to keep up, his boots slipping in the mud, but Max was a guided missile. He knew exactly where he was going. They reached the center of the park, where an old stone gazebo stood overlooking a murky pond. Max stopped at the bottom of the steps and let out a long, mournful howl.
Miller shone his light into the gazebo. Sitting on a bench, huddled into a tight ball, was a figure. She was soaked to the bone, wearing only a thin sweater, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold her shattered pieces together. She didn't move when the light hit her. She didn't look up. She was staring at the dark water of the pond, her body rocking slightly back and forth. "Rachel?" Miller called out, his voice soft but firm, trying not to startle her. The figure froze. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollowed out by days of starvation and sleeplessness. But when she saw the dog standing at the foot of the stairs, a flicker of life returned to her gaze. "Max?" She cracked, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. Did he make it?" Max bounded up the stairs, shaking off the water and resting his heavy head on her shivering knees. He licked her hand, a gesture of pure, unadulterated forgiveness. Rachel collapsed forward, burying her face in the dog's wet fur, sobbing with a force that shook her entire body. It was the sound of a heart releasing a burden it was never meant to carry alone. Miller slowly walked up the steps, crouching down to her level. He didn't take out handcuffs. He didn't read her rights. He took off his heavy rain jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders. "Noah is safe, Rachel," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's at St. Jude's. The doctors are with him. He's warm. He's alive." Rachel looked up, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. I just wanted him to live," she choked out. "I didn't know what else to do. Max was the only one who cared." "You did the bravest thing you could," Miller told her, offering his hand. "But now Noah needs his mother. And Max, I think Max needs you to come home too." The ride back to the hospital was silent, save for the hum of the heater and Rachel's soft weeping. Max refused to sit in the back cage. He sat in the passenger seat, next to Rachel, his head resting in her lap, his eyes alert, watching the road. He wasn't just a retired police dog anymore. He was a guardian who had successfully completed his most important mission. But the real test, the reunion, was yet to come. Miller radioed ahead. "Dispatch, I'm coming in. I have the mother. Prepare a room. And let the doc know we're bringing the hero too." When they arrived at the emergency bay, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon. Dr. Elena Russo was waiting at the doors, her arms crossed, looking anxious. When she saw Rachel step out of the cruiser, supported by Miller and flanked closely by Max, her expression softened. They walked through the quiet corridors of the hospital, the squeak of wet shoes on tile echoing like a heartbeat. They reached the pediatric ward. Through the glass window of the observation room, a small crib was visible. Inside, hooked up to monitors but sleeping peacefully, was Noah. His color had returned. He looked peaceful. Rachel pressed her hand against the glass, her knees buckling. Max stood beside her, rising on his hind legs to place his paws on the ledge, looking through the glass at the boy he had carried through the storm. "Do you want to hold him?" Elena asked softly from behind them. Rachel turned, fear and hope warring in her eyes. "Can I? After what I did?" "You're his mother," Elena said, opening the door. "And thanks to you and him," she nodded at Max, "he has a future." Rachel stepped into the room, approaching the crib as if it were holy ground. She reached down, her trembling fingers brushing Noah's cheek. The baby stirred, opening his eyes that mirrored his mother's. He let out a soft coo, recognizing her scent, her presence. Rachel lifted him up, clutching him to her chest, burying her nose in his neck, inhaling the scent of life she thought she had lost forever.
Max didn't bark. He didn't demand attention. He simply walked over to the chair where Rachel sat, rocking her son, and rested his chin gently on her knee, right beside the baby's blanket. He let out a long, contented sigh, his eyes closing as the exhaustion of the night finally overtook him. Rachel reached out a trembling hand, burying her fingers in the coarse fur of the hero who had carried her world in his jaws. In that quiet hospital room, amidst the beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic, a broken family was being welded back together by the silent, unconditional love of a dog. Officer Miller watched from the doorway, a hard lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. He had seen the worst of humanity in his 20 years on the force: violence, neglect, cruelty. But tonight, he had seen the best. He had seen a mother willing to break her own heart to save her child, and a beast who understood the sanctity of life better than most humans. He wiped a straight tear from his cheek, turning to Dr. Russo. "I'm going to make some calls," Miller said, his voice husky. "Social services needs to know the context, and housing. I know a landlord who owes me a favor. We're not letting them go back to that house. Not tonight. Not ever." The days that followed were a blur of kindness that Rachel hadn't believed existed anymore. The story of the angel dog spread through the precinct and then the town. Donations poured in: diapers, clothes, food, and offers of employment. But the most important legal battle was fought by Officer Miller, not for custody of the child, but for the custody of the dog. Since Max's handler had passed, the department agreed. There was no better retirement home for a hero than with the family he had saved. 6 months later, the sun was setting over a small, modest house on the quiet side of town. The yard was fenced, the grass green and neatly trimmed. On the porch, a healthy, chubby-cheeked baby boy was pulling himself up on the railing, giggling at a butterfly. Sitting right beside him, watchful and majestic, was Max. His coat was shiny now, the ribs no longer visible. He looked younger, the weight of the lonely nights lifting off of his shoulders. Rachel stepped out onto the porch, holding 2 bowls, one with warm dinner for herself and one filled with premium kibble. She sat on the steps, watching her son and her savior. She looked different, too. The hollows in her cheeks were filled, and the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. She reached over and scratched Max behind his ears. "You knew, didn't you, to me?" she whispered to him. "You knew we just needed a chance." Max leaned into her touch, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the wooden deck. He kept one eye on the street, ever the protector, but his body was relaxed. He wasn't searching for a rescue anymore. He was home. This story isn't just about a smart dog or a desperate mother. It's a reminder that help often comes in the forms we least expect. When Rachel hit rock bottom, she didn't find a handout, she found a paw. In a world that often turns its back on the broken, Max reminded us that loyalty isn't about who feeds you, it's about who you're willing to bleed for. Sometimes, saving a life isn't about grand gestures or medical miracles. Sometimes, it's just about being there, carrying the burden when the other person is too weak to walk. Max saved Noah from the cold, but he saved Rachel from despair. And in return, they gave him a purpose that went beyond his badge.
they saved each other. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Hug your pets a little tighter, and remember, even in the darkest storms, there is always a path home. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.